Hi, welcome to Universal Harmony Illustrated. One more time. This is a summary of a spiritual transformation that I've personally experienced over the past several years, over a decade or so. And because of the changes that have taken place in my conscious perception and the associated improvements in my life that have come about, it's my hope that telling you of my whole overall experience might at least serve as a catalyst for anyone who wants to prove for themselves that there's more to life than meets the senses. There's more to life than what appears to be happening to you, and that we're not stuck in the rut that so often we think we're in. And I'll also be sharing, as time goes on, some more specific personal spiritual experiences, some healing experiences, also in video form, most of which I've already documented in writing over the years, and I have some of them actually in various formats on one of my still existing blogs. And some of these experiences are from recent years, some from decades past, but all that in due time. I want to give you an overview of the significant change that has occurred in my life and the conditions of my life that have been associated with uh, a transformation of the way I see things. So this is a summary of a story of changes in personal thinking patterns that have clearly resulted in manifesting physical, material, and financial improvements in my life. And everything I'm going to tell about here took place over the past decade. I'm going to tell you about how I've learned to feel better about life, and how, as I learned to feel better, so did life actually get better. There's a direct correlation. So if you're in a condition of being depressed and you're not actively getting out of the condition of being depressed, the way your life is manifested is going to manifest itself in an equivalent darkness. And through this discovery of how much in control of myself I can be by controlling my thought, my income situation improved, my family situation became harmonious. Everything just took a turn for the better. And I have noticed that this took place in proportion with the effort I made to learn how to be and stay happy always, regardless of the evidence of life circumstances. And those circumstances often scream out and want to tell you how bad life is. Obviously, I haven't mastered this change in thinking patterns perfectly. And so, of course, challenges keep on presenting themselves. And, of course, no one ever will master life perfectly as long as our life continues on the human plane. I feel like what we're actually trying to do is to ultimately elevate ourselves above this human perception, which is so limiting. But when you get the drift of how to respond to and how to feel about the conditions that you find yourself in, the conditions that you find your life in, you find that changes do take place. And up front here in the beginning of the video, I'm going to say that I have recently concluded that it all has to do with a change in my perception and practice of being grateful. This little history is about how the application of gratitude has literally transformed and keeps on transforming my life in a better direction. And honestly, I feel like thinking this way can bring anyone the same level of transformations, especially people who are aware that they're in a negative, depressive situation and want to do something about it, but don't know what. So I'm going to be telling you about some of my own ups and downs. I'm going to start with how my life used to be, how I used to feel about myself, which started with having a sound and positive and happy, spiritually based upbringing, very spiritual upbringing, a wonderful, just awesome childhood. And after a really successful traditional education that was supported by my parents, to earn me a degree in engineering from a respected university, that was followed by almost 3 decades of interesting jobs in various kind of related career fields and graduate school and subjects that interested me here and there, opportunities for travel, work and fun. By all accounts, I was leading a life that most people would consider financially and personally successful on the surface. And in the midst of the manifestation of a great human life like this, I found that suddenly, due to decisions that I made that are kind of hard to explain, but it was due to decisions I made, a little over 10 years ago, I found myself suddenly divorced, jobless, and then suddenly just watching my life savings dwindle away really fast. Watching what I'd always thought was a really solid fund that ultimately would support a nice, comfortable retirement, I watched it all disappear. And on top of that, at the same time, I found myself suddenly also living in a kind of a tough economy. In a time when everyone agreed that there wasn't a lot of human hope for becoming financially secure again for those that were in a tough situation. But later on, I figured out that that little bit of hope was little only as long as I kept looking at my life the way I had gradually trained myself to unintentionally as happening to me. I was looking at my life objectively as if it's a thing that's out there separate from me that I'm experiencing, that's happening to me that I had no control over. And this is the key, the repeating factor. It's learning subjectivity versus objectivity. Learning to be subjective, to know that you are in control of every situation you're in and that you're actually the author of every situation you're in. That combined with a feeling of increased gratitude, I'll tell you that I learned that I can put myself in control by thinking and acting and knowing that life is subjective. By convincing myself and knowing, ultimately figuring out that I'm the controller of my life, always. And the same is true for everyone. My story went like this. After my first divorce, after being married for 27 years, at the age of 50, I lost the majority of my life savings and my retirement funds and all the equity I had in my house. I had to give it away. And then a couple of years later, already into a second marriage and in a replacement house, I lost that house and all of its equity. What little equity there was, because I got into it with not a lot of money down because I didn't have a whole lot left. But that equity vanished as well, and as well as the investment value of the house, because the house had to be sold in a short sale for less than half the value I'd purchased it for after the housing bubble just burst, because my previously solid source of income, a business I was in that had enabled me to buy into an overpriced property with a ridiculous high payment in the first place, that business was construction industry based, and it just vanished with the appearance of an economic downturn. And so it was impossible for me to make the payments anymore. At the same time that the housing value bubble just burst. So I felt victimized by the economy. Feeling victimized is not the right attitude. That is objective thinking. That is a belief that things are happening to you in your life, which is the way it appears, and it's the way we're trained to think. But it's not so. While that was going on, in an attempt to save my credit and avoid becoming homeless, I ended up spending 100% of the remainder of what was once my future retirement funds. Those are the funds that got hit really hard by the first divorce, but then they finally got completely eaten up in the second round of what I felt was just bad luck. And bad luck is just that objective thought again. Woe is me, the circumstances of life are killing me. Gloom, despair, and agony on me. So what happened was I spent the rest of those funds making the unreasonably high payments, selling off vehicles and whatever else I had that was of value to generate the needed cash to prevent being forced out of the house. But eventually, I just had to give up on the house. But that only happened after all the money and all the valuable possessions that I could use to generate cash were gone. And then to continue with the gloom and despair story, right about the time I was just all out of money and still not reasonably employed, then the folly of my second marriage showed itself, and I ended up ejecting my wife from that house, from the second house, which of course resulted in more emotional turmoil. And all that took place just before I left that house, abandoned it, and let the bank put it up for short sale during the time I was filing for the second divorce. And so now I was feeling victimized not only by the economy, but by the immoral actions of my second wife as well. I was really in a objective woe is me, gloom and despair mode of thinking. Now, at that time, the most positive and progressive thing that happened to me was when I most needed the support of a rational and subjective thinker in my life. I found one. Shortly thereafter, I did connect with the wonderful woman who later became my permanent wife and life partner, which did me a world of good and set me on kind of the right path. We'd already been good platonic friends for several years, and the move to establish a relationship with her was the beginning of my life healing, because it was the beginning of the carrying out of a total change in personal attitude. It was the beginning of my healing, which involved it was the beginning of the healing of the condition that evolved by allowing myself to be victimized by my own negative beliefs, to be victimized by my own deep-rooted negative convictions. And as I saw and began to feel that she was a positive decision that I'd made for myself, then the quality of my life at least started to apparently turn around, and I started feeling somewhat more positive. I had a long way to go, and it didn't actually result in immediate changes in condition, but this was an initial important mental turning point. Her presence and her positive influence helped to keep me pointed in the right mental direction over the years that followed. So back to that point, after I left my old world behind, the second marriage, the second house, I moved to another state to get married for the third time to my new life partner. I still continued for quite a while, for several years, being totally broke, wondering where the money was going to come from to pay the bills, thinking of myself as useless and feeling hopeless. And feeling is very powerful. I was dragging my own self down and dragging down my new wife with these feelings. But at the same time, I was knowing deep down, I knew it intellectually at least, that life didn't have to be this way. So during this period of several years, I tried several jobs. Each one was promising at the beginning, but either there was always some conflict that arose in everything I did, or there wasn't enough pay, or both. During that time, we did get into our own website hosting business, which made a little money, and it was fun and interesting, but it also never brought in enough money to pay all the bills. I know now, looking back on it, that I was looking at my jobs as things external to me that could pull me out of what I had declared was a rut I was in, rather than seeing employment and business for what it really is. It's the presence and indication of limitless possibilities that I could grab hold of and use to my advantage. But I didn't. I was down in the mental rut. And these conflicts kept appearing because I never felt confidence and I never expected satisfaction. In fact, I'd gradually learned to expect failure in life. And I figured out later that the income was always insufficient because my thought was always focused too much on the insufficient pay and the insufficient amount of business. And my thought was focused too little on gratitude for the work, gratitude for the job, gratitude for getting paid well for what work I was able to do. And I was thinking too little, I was appreciating too little all the good that was really already present. So consequently, every job, as well as our own business, was stressful, filled with impossible time limits, expectations from management that couldn't be made, frustrations with clients, frustrations with people I worked for, etc. And I taught myself to expect these things. So, of course, that was what I got. But all this time, intellectually, from my spiritual education I had received earlier in life, from my more successful times, and from my upbringing, what I'd learned from my parents as a child, I knew better. I knew I was thinking wrong. I knew better intellectually, anyway, but I wasn't able to admit to myself or to figure out how to get out of this circle of causing my own bad feelings and my own bad consequences. But it was really subtle. And that's the way personal reality is. It's your reality. It was my personal reality. And personal reality feels very real. So you feel stuck in it. And it takes really some enlightenment to and effort to realize that you can think and feel your way out of it. My personal reality was something that I had unintentionally created for myself. And I'd felt like these bad things were happening to me and that there wasn't anything I could do about them. Because every time I tried, I'd run into another barrier. But that really was also just the very same objective thinking pattern that was putting itself up each and every time. Now, that's a short summary of the objective thinking pattern and lack of gratitude for already present good that I had allowed to trap me. And for a number of years, it grew. I finally started climbing out more by accident than by intention, although I did have the continual kind of guidance and push from my wife. But I always had made some feeble efforts at feeling grateful, and as a result, I noticed that things would take a corresponding small turn for the better when I realized that. But it took me a number of years to see what was going on, to get beyond that stage, because those little efforts of being grateful that would cause a corresponding turn for the better would always turn around. I needed to become aware that gratitude and attitude was the cause of every one of those upswings. And sometimes I was thinking that life was improving because I just accidentally stumbled across something outside of myself that was working. That wasn't the case at all. It was the recognition of the power of gratitude that allowed me to stay in the long term on an uphill track that wouldn't result in another downfall. So gradually I started to realize that I was putting up my own mental obstructions. So as time went on, I started becoming able to see that I could take them down. And then improvements came a little more quickly, along with my own sense of self-approval also was improving, and my expression and realization of increased gratitude. And now that I'm well beyond this frustrating stage of figuring out how to make the curve rise without falling, now positive changes come to me faster than ever. And I'd say that the majority of the notable changes in my world that brought me up and out of a self-created depressive state took place in the very last 12-month period of those 10 or so years. And right now, I think I'm still on that upward climb. Now, I need to embellish this story with some details that explain the source of the seemingly sudden growth in attitude that I experienced that kept me on this continual upwards climb. So going back a little bit, for the first 6 years of our married life, I'd moved up there to be with her, and during most of the job searching, we lived in a remote rural area in the Ozarks, which was part of the problem. After a lot of frustration, I stepped up my job search, and I was willing to go just about anywhere just to feel gainfully employed again. And so finally I happened across a company in Miami that was offering a good job in my old profession, which was land surveying. And so I ended up receiving a job offer and accepting it, and we quite suddenly went down to Miami. My mother, who lived in Central Florida at the time, not South Florida, at the same time was in need of some personal assistance and assistance with her house, and it seemed like it would be a good plan to be closer to her, at least be in South Florida, rather than being halfway across the country like we had been. So we went ahead with the decision, and then it turned out that the job in Miami wasn't a good fit for me at all. I recognized that quick, and I left it immediately. So I'm going to try to make a long story short. We ended up coming back to my mother's house in Central Florida and staying while I looked for a job. And this was going on 3 years ago at the time I'm telling you this story. Now, here the local economy was much better than where we were coming from in the Ozarks, and we felt like it made really no sense to go back to rural Missouri. And so we decided to stay. I'd get a job here and be here to help Mom with her house and with her personal needs. And it was all a very quick decision. There were also some loose ends to that, because in order to make a permanent move, we had to go back up and get things, and we had to sell the old house, and that all kind of unfolded quite easily, and we felt like it was the right thing to do to stay here. So we stayed, and Mom had a little apartment behind the house where we could live if we cleaned it up. So we did. It was kind of disgusting, but we did. And while I was looking for a job, then we also now had time to help Mom. She actually had to get her cataracts surgically removed because she just was having trouble seeing well enough to do the basic things in life again. And that involved a few day trips out of town to the facility where that was done, and it also involved being a lot of help around the house and helping her with some personal and mobility problems she was dealing with, and it felt good to be helping my mother. I felt like I needed to return the favor for all the positive things that she'd taught me and everything that she'd given to me when I was growing up. And I believe that during this time, helping out my mom, I was planting seeds for the growth of my personal gratitude for everything that was good in my life. Gratitude that I'd tucked away and never really nurtured, kind of forgotten about. So after a few months with Mom, all the time I was looking for good work, and I did go through one more unsuccessful round in my task of looking for employment. But after I got that last bad experience behind me, then a contract business opportunity in a brand new line of work fell into place for me. And so I took it. It took a good while to develop, around a year or so. It wasn't exactly what I was looking for in the first place, but the job ultimately developed into the first reasonable flow of income that I had experienced for quite a few years. And up front, to start this job, it required that I purchase a particular kind of vehicle, because all I had was an old car. I had a feeling, an intuition that this job was the right thing to do. So based on that, I went to the nearest car dealer and just purchased what I needed. One quick move, a quick decision. There could have been a problem with that because at the time I really had no money of my own to put down, and really bad credit from having just come from too many years of being financially unproductive and falling behind. But I assured myself that if this was a right and possible and good thing to do, then all I needed to do was know that. And while I was waiting to be approved for the loan, that's what I did. I knew this was the right thing to do. And I was approved immediately for the loan. I drove away in a brand new van. Now, maybe part of that was a sales game. I don't know, but I felt like I overcome an obstacle there. Because I went to work immediately with the van, and it felt good. It felt like I was beginning to be actually independent again, even though I wasn't making much money at the beginning. That feeling was really an essential building block. And my mother was also very pleased that I'd found employment, and as the conditions, in my thought, became gradually more self-assured, as I became more grateful for how things were unfolding in a kind of unexpected but better way, I noticed the conditions of my work gradually improving, as well as my earning potential. And I don't think I was actually aware of what was going on while that was taking place. I only was able to see it in retrospect, looking at it later. During that first year of the new contract job, and that I'm still at now after more than 2 years at the time I'm making this video, but just a few months into that first year, Mom started having some serious mobility problems, which ultimately led us, I say us, mutual decision to admit her into a non-medical nursing facility for what we had hoped would just be a temporary recovery period. And I mentioned the fact that it was a non-medical facility because this was important to Mom and to me as well, because Mom was always a dedicated Christian Scientist, and she lived her life very spiritually, and that means as non-medically as she possibly could. And she always said that if she had to go somewhere to be cared for, if we couldn't handle taking care of her, that it would be a non-medical Christian Science nursing facility that she'd go to. And so that was where she went. In the weeks leading up to her going into the nursing home, I think now that she'd already decided to herself it was time for her to move on. And so it wasn't really a big surprise when she passed away, but she did. Contrary to our hopes, She passed away after a short period in the nursing facility, and the response to that, my personal response to that, I actually didn't expect. It shook me up more than I had expected. Perhaps it had a bigger impact on me than any other previous event in my life, which you might say, why is that? Why should it be so? Because by earthly standards, she wasn't young. But I was emotionally and spiritually attached to my mother. In my view, I think I was attached spiritually more closely than other members of the family, just on the basis of our common spirituality. Because she'd been my spiritual mentor and teacher from the beginning, and we'd always freely talked about spiritual subjects, while the other family members really didn't seem to have so much interest in this kind of thing. But Mom and I consistently prayed together. We studied spiritual writings together. We discussed spiritual things. We talked about the meaning of life. And I can say honestly that I've had only one other relationship in my life that would even approximate the spiritual closeness I had with my mother. And that's actually the relationship I share with my wife now. But during the grieving process for my mother's passing, I started to naturally focus on gratitude for my mother. I spent a lot of time reviewing memories. And my mom had established for me a remarkable spiritual foundation from my earliest childhood. She'd also been the one at my oldest brother's bedside, along with me, at the moment that he prematurely departed from this world far sooner than he should have at the age of only 52. I also had a connection with my mother because I had the privilege of accompanying her as a travel companion to her annual Christian Science Association meeting in Milan, in Italy, for many years. It was a regular journey, which in turn, during those years, it also enabled me to maintain my own personal contacts from a previous period of my life in Switzerland. And we'd always both go to Milan, and then we'd go to eastern Switzerland together. In fact, the very last time she went, Kristen and I had just got married, and Mom paid for her and Kristen's daughter to come along on the trip. She was quite generous. I always felt closer to my mother than I'd ever felt to anyone else, ever, which probably isn't unusual for a lot of people, but it was especially so for me. I've figured out from talking to a lot of other people and the relationships they've had with their mothers. And I continue now to feel real gratitude for all that she ever did for me. And I found that gratitude had found less recognition from me up until the point that Mom started to have trouble, and then suddenly she wasn't around anymore. And I even felt a little guilty for not having appreciated her as much as I could have when she was still with us. But finally I did realize through this kind of complex mental process of grieving and recovering that it was gratitude that was continuing to heal my life now at a faster rate than it had been healed before. It took the passing of my mother for me to come to the realization that I needed to practice deeper gratitude. Not just think and talk about gratitude, not just mention it in passing. There's a big difference between thinking about something and talking about something and actually doing it. Too often we think that thinking about something is the act of doing it, and it's not. It's like the difference between belief and conviction. Belief puts you on the right path. Conviction brings you to the final destination. But the bottom line is that my life actually changed as a result of this outpouring of heartfelt gratitude. So with the provisions that Mom had left behind for us, we had some blessings. My youngest brother, who'd spent his entire life with Mom, has been able to continue to live here on the property, in the apartment I mentioned, where we lived when we first arrived 3 years back. And Kristen and I were granted the privilege of inheriting the house and the entire property free and clear. And we also were enabled to pay off debts that had been building up and that we felt like were haunting us, accumulated from too many years of unsuccessful business and employment. We even got the debt of my vehicle from my job out of the way. And finally, and perhaps best of all, and I don't know whether from Mom's perspective, wherever she is now mentally after passing over to the other side, if she can see this, but Kristen was enabled earlier this year to move her daughter and our 2 grandchildren from the same depressed rural Ozark region to be with us, where they're now heading towards a more prosperous life as well. And all at the same time, the improvements in my income have just kept unexpectedly growing. And those improvements have provided the additional funding necessary to support them here until they also get their feet on the ground. And now I'm bringing home as much as I'd made in any of my earlier professions. Even though it's a lot of hard work, we're actually catching up financially. And in retrospect, I honestly observed that the big shifts in income began to occur simultaneously with heartfelt expressions of gratitude for my mother. And at the same time, I intuitively feel that my life is now heading, as a result of this mental work, in a new spiritual direction. And in fact, that's exactly why I feel the inspiration to make these videos and why you're listening to my story right now. I want to share with you the good news that my experience has showed me how spiritual advancement results in life advancement. And not only that, spiritual advancement doesn't have to be all esoteric and theoretical. Spiritual advancement can be as simple as carrying out the act of feeling love and gratitude. That's the important point in this whole discussion. Feel love and gratitude in your life. That's the key. So this was a long video, and I appreciate you making it through to the end, assuming that someone's here at the end watching. And as I said up front, I really hope that the sharing of my experience might serve as a catalyst for someone else and that my stories illustrated the power of heartfelt gratitude to transform life. Thank you, and I'll see you in another video soon.